If you think burnout syndrome is just about choosing between two men, then you've already missed the point. Hi, I'm Big Fan BL, and in this video, I want to talk about why burnout syndrome is one of the most misunderstood and divisive BLs of the year. I've been incredibly curious about the reception and the overall atmosphere surrounding Burnout Syndrome, directed by Nechi. This is one of those series that doesn't rely on aggressive promotion or hype-heavy marketing. Instead, it trusts its storytelling, casting choices, and emotional restraint to pull the audience in, and that quiet confidence is what makes it genuinely beautiful. At its core, the series follows Jira, played by Gun, an artist by nature who's been struggling to find stable work for a long time. Burned out by professional pressure and financial insecurity, Jira begins to drift away from the person he once was, eventually resorting to morally gray, even shady work just to survive. That's where he encounters Ko, played by Off, who offers Jira a contract, not to create, not to grow, but to represent him, to meet people on his behalf. To become useful in ways that slowly blur Jira's sense of self. At the same time, Jira meets Fime, played by Du, at the Burnout Bar, a space where proximity grows quietly, where two people bond over shared exhaustion, emotional fatigue, and the weight of expectations pressing down on them from different directions. Jira finds himself pulled between two very different forces, Fime, who represents emotional safety and possibility, and Ko, who represents stability, power, and control, two ends of the same spectrum, tied together by Jira's need to survive. And if you think that's the whole story, trust me, I haven't even scratched the surface. Because Burnout Syndrome isn't just asking who Jira ends up with, it's asking why these relationships don't hit the same, whether this love triangle actually works narratively, how burnout shapes every decision these characters make, and whether this story is really about love at all, or about what happens when reason collides with passion under pressure. And because the series asks such complicated questions, it also creates a very specific kind of viewing experience. Burnout Syndrome is a show that does some things exceptionally well, and others that will absolutely divide its audience. So before we talk about where it may falter, let's start with what this series truly understands, and what it gets right. One of Burnout Syndrome's greatest strengths is that it never treats burnout as a single breaking moment. It understands burnout as something slow, accumulating, and suffocating, a condition that seeps into people long before it explodes. We see this clearly across different characters. Take Mon, losing his job doesn't immediately destroy him, but the frustration festers. Instead of release, he keeps pushing himself toward emotional extremes, trying to outrun the feeling of failure rather than process it. Or take Jira, right from the very first episode. When he loses his job, there is no dramatic outburst. What follows instead is numbness, a quiet, unsettling attempt to convince himself that he's fine, that he can adapt, that he can still fit into society if he just tries hard enough. And that's where the series becomes uncomfortable in the best way. Jira doesn't simply take on degrading work, he accepts another person's identity. He agrees to perform a goth persona for his client, not because he embraces it, but because he feels he has no choice. This distinction matters. Jira can accept the mask, but he cannot inhabit it. The pressure keeps building, silently, relentlessly. It's only when he's fully submerged in the belief that he is not enough, that something inside him finally collapses. The moment he tears down the carcass he's been wearing to camouflage his identity is devastating, and Gun's raw, high-pitched scream in that scene is not just acting, it's release. That breakdown doesn't feel performative, it feels inevitable. This is risky storytelling, and Burnout Syndrome commits to it. The series is never afraid of stillness, it allows scenes to breathe, even when nothing is being said, trusting the audience to sit with the discomfort instead of rushing toward explanation. This is especially evident in the moments where Jira is painting. The act of creation is shown clearly and patiently, not as filler, but as narrative language. These sequences, featuring artwork created by artist Naisu, are not hurried. Yes, they're edited, but they remain deliberate. And because this is the story of an artist, the series uses Jira's art symbolically, not as decoration, but as emotional foreshadowing. This respect for silence extends beyond art. When Ko asks Jira to show him his unfinished painting, Jira complies, and in doing so, exposes a version of himself that feels far more vulnerable than when his work is complete. Finished art gives Jira stature, unfinished art strips him bare. By letting these moments exist without dialogue, burnout syndrome turns silence into confession, and creation into emotional exposure. One of burnout syndrome's biggest strengths lies in its acting choices, specifically, how internal they are. This approach fits the theme perfectly. Burnout rarely announces itself through dramatic breakdowns. Most of the time, it lives quietly, in held-back emotions, delayed reactions, and things left unsaid. I can't fully express how relieved I was when I learned that a project like Burnout Syndrome was entrusted to Offgun and Do. These are actors mature enough to understand restraint, and skilled enough to make stillness compelling. They don't overplay their emotions, they let discomfort linger, they allow scenes to feel unfinished, unresolved, much like the mental state their characters inhabit. And Gunn, in particular, deserves special mention. There's a quiet sadness he carries so naturally that it never feels forced. His performance as Jira doesn't demand sympathy, it earns it. Watching him, you don't feel like you're observing a character. It feels uncomfortably close to witnessing a real person slowly wearing down. I say this without exaggeration, I would watch Gunn act for decades, in any role, simply because of how truthfully he inhabits emotional fatigue. While the story does lean into some questionable choices toward the end, especially that the heart wants what it wants framing, the foundation it's built on remains solid. Burnout Syndrome positions its real antagonist not as a single person, but as a system, shaped by AI, professional instability, and the fear of becoming replaceable. AI exists here like a shadow, rarely seen, but constantly influencing choices and anxieties. This isn't speculative, it mirrors the reality we're already living in, particularly for artists, freelancers, students, and young professionals navigating burnout in an increasingly unstable landscape. Even when the narrative falters, its themes never feel abstract. The fear, exhaustion, and pressure it explores remain deeply relevant. One last thing I want to say before I end this part: as viewers, we often expect fandoms to fill in the gaps when storytelling falls short. We explain, defend, theorize, and sometimes even repair narratives that weren't fully thought through. But in this case, I genuinely appreciate that Burnout Syndrome doesn't ask the fandom to do that work for it. The storytelling stands on its own, so on behalf of the fandom, I also want to acknowledge when a series respects its audience, when it brings a unique topic to the table, commits to it fully, and trusts strong performances to carry the weight of the story. Credit where it's due to GMMTV for backing a project like this, and for casting actors capable of restraint, vulnerability, and emotional precision. This isn't a story that can be easily compared to other BLs, and that's a good thing. It doesn't recycle familiar beats or lean on overused tropes. It exists in its own space, and whether people love it or struggle with it, that uniqueness alone makes it worth talking about. In the next video, I'll talk about where Burnout Syndrome may not land the same way, not to tear it down, but to understand it fully.